1. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Dr. Mimi Knoll. I'm president of JOMA and also a radiation oncologist in New York. I'm really excited to be here tonight with all of you, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to introduce our amazing panel very soon. I first wanted to thank our co-hosts for tonight's event. I'm just going to share my screen. So we have a really incredible co-hosts and sponsors for tonight, including Touro University, OJNA, or the Orthodox Jewish Nurses Association, the JAPA, Jewish Association of Physician Assistants, Ezras Cholim, Refuah Healthcare, ODA, Primary Healthcare Network, and Community Counter. So I'm going to first introduce our first speaker for tonight is Dr. Alan Kadish, who is president of Touro College and University System, which is the largest Jewish-sponsored education institution in the United States. Before succeeding Dr. Bernard Lander as Touro's second president in March of 2010, Dr. Kadish distinguished himself as a prominent cardiologist, a dedicated teacher and researcher, and experienced administrator. He's a graduate of Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and he received postdoctoral training at Brigham and Women's Hospital, an affiliate of Harvard Medical School. He is past chair of a clinical cardiology program committee of the American Heart Association and has been elected to prestigious scientific research and educational societies involving the American Association of Professors, the American Society for Clinical Investigation, and the American Society of Physicians. Welcome, Dr. Kadish.
Thank you so much, Dr. Knoll. Let me start by thanking the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association for inviting me to speak this evening and for taking up the important topic of the COVID-19 vaccine at this town hall. The association should be applauded for its support, mentorship, and networking opportunities to Jewish female physicians, trainees, and other healthcare professionals. Beyond this important work, encouraging others to prevent the spread of COVID and finding ways to get people in the community vaccinated as quickly as possible is quite literally saving lives. I'm no stranger to controversy surrounding vaccines. Beginning in January of 2020, my fellow physicians, scientists, and educators at Touro and New York Medical College have worked hard to debunk mythology and misinformation about COVID prevention and about vaccines. It's important to note, while resistance to COVID vaccination and resistance to restrictions impacts the Orthodox Jewish community, resistance to the COVID vaccine is far from a Jewish problem. In the United States, nearly half of those who consider themselves conservatives were recently polled as saying they don't want to take the vaccine. Quinnipiac University poll just released this past week found that 45% of Republicans surveyed say they do not plan to get vaccinated. That's a startlingly high number, which, if generally true, opens the question of how difficult it will be to obtain herd immunity in the United States. So why have parts of the Jewish community not accepted the restrictions that were put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19? And why is it that it seems to some observers that there's a higher than average incidence of vaccine hesitancy in the community? You'll hear from several experts about this issue tonight, but I wanted to begin by sharing some of my own thoughts from my dealings with the community. One reason suggested is that for some members of some Jewish communities, science is viewed with skepticism, and the level of scientific knowledge is not uniformly high. However, this theory is hard to represent the only explanation for vaccine resistance because members of the same community use highly sophisticated networks to obtain the most advanced medical treatment. Perhaps they feel there's a difference between prevention and treatment. A second possible explanation invokes not just skepticism regarding science, but suspicion regarding government and government mandates. There is, of course, some historical justification for this feeling, as anti-Semitic or anti-religious government actions have unfortunately been present in our history. And although there have been some exceptions, there doesn't appear to be much evidence that government regulation has unfairly targeted the Jewish community. Nevertheless, because of our unique lifestyle, the restrictions have had a disproportionate impact on observant Jews. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, some have suggested that the cultural aspect is most important. In some communities, social behavior often proceeds in lockstep and is driven by complex interactions. And thus, if masks are uncomfortable or vaccines are unappreciated, social pressures against wearing masks and accepting vaccinations can proliferate and affect behavior. As you as a group treat members of our community, you perhaps will encounter some mix of these reasons, some of the others you may hear about tonight. Thus, an individualized approach in dealing with single patients and a varied approach when dealing with the community will likely be most effective at overcoming vaccine hesitancy. As we know from experience with other vaccines, the task is not easy and the material rewards are few. Nevertheless, we're counting on you to do your best. So allow me to conclude much the same way that I began, by saying that this group, JOMA, should be commended for your important efforts. The United States has seen just short of 32 million COVID cases and 567,000 deaths. Your contribution to preventing further tragedy is vital. Thanks for having me, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. We appreciate it so much, Dr. Kadish. So I'm going to introduce our panelists now. And again, I just want to remind everyone, why are we doing this event? We're doing this event for you, for all healthcare professionals. You and myself, I'll include myself, we've been working really, really hard throughout COVID, right? We've never stopped working. We've never stopped seeing patients. We've never stopped doing our day jobs and our night jobs. And whether you're an expert in vaccines or not, you're the ones that your patients, your friends, your colleagues are turning to with questions. And we've heard from healthcare professionals from across the spectrum that it's hard to know what information to share. It's hard to know how to share information in the best way. That's why we are here tonight. That's why you're here tonight. We're going to be talking about the basics, the information that you want to know, that you want to be able to share with your patients, and we also want to answer your questions. So first, we're going to start with Dr. Mulligan, who, as you probably know, is director of the Division of Infectious Disease and Immunology in the Department of Medicine and director of the NYU Langone Vaccine Center. You may have listened to Dr. Lisa Minkin's interview with him on the JOMA podcast. He joined NYU Langone Health in 2018. He's a translational physician scientist who leads a research clinic and a research laboratory. He conducts vaccine clinical trials and clinical studies of emerging infections and has studied HIV, Zika, Ebola, bird flu, 2009 pandemic influenza, and now coronavirus. He's a graduate of University of Notre Dame, University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, and during infectious disease training at UAB, he did postdoc molecular virology training with Dr. Richard Compens, a renowned virologist. Dr. Mulligan served as a lead investigator of NIH-funded HIV/AIDS clinical trials unit conducting AIDS and TB research, and served as a principal investigator of an NIH-funded vaccine and treatment evaluation unit, and was one of 9 national units funded by NIH to conduct clinical research on medical countermeasures to combat infectious disease threats to human health. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Mulligan.
Well, thank you, Dr. Knoll. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to tonight very much. I would just like to start with a few comments, and then I will look forward to the rest of the evening. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get started. Try to move this over, I'm sorry. Here we go. Okay. So I'm a researcher and chief of ID. I love seeing patients and I love doing clinical research. And after training in virology, I started doing vaccine research focused on HIV vaccine, which is an ongoing pandemic and one for which we don't yet have a vaccine. But fortunately, we do have a vaccine. We have several for the current pandemic. Our work at NYU is funded through the National Institutes of Health. We were very fortunate in 2020 to be awarded a vaccine and treatment evaluation unit by NIH. There are just 10 of these in the country. And the mission, the vision of our center is to protect and restore human health through infectious disease clinical trials. And we study vaccines, but also treatments, biomarkers, diagnostics, et cetera. And we work in many communities. We have 5 vaccine research clinics around New York City and the surrounding area. And those include 3 in Manhattan, the NYU Tisch Kimmel location on First Avenue, the Bellevue Hospital, part of the city hospital system right next door. And right next door to that, also on First Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, the VA. And then we have 2 NYU hospital vaccine research clinics at the Brooklyn and Long Island locations. So 5 clinics around the city. Not only have we worked with NIH, but we've also worked with Pfizer, with Lilly in developing monoclonal antibodies and vaccines and other treatments. So I feel that I'm well positioned to contribute, I hope, to tonight's discussion. We've been involved from the very beginning in COVID vaccine research. In fact, on May 4th, the day that the first humans to receive a Pfizer vaccine were vaccinated, we were vaccinating at NYU. And we may have given the first human to get a Pfizer RNA COVID-19 vaccine, their vaccine. And it's been a privilege to do this work. But I have a friend, Walt Orenstein, who says that vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. So having a vaccine on the shelf is one thing, but we need to get it into people's arms in order for it to do what it's intended to do. And this next slide comes from my colleague and a member of your organization, Dr. Ellie Carmody, with whom I work at NYU. And she has now submitted this study for publication. And she surveyed the knowledge and attitudes towards COVID vaccines in an Orthodox community in Brooklyn. And I think the point I want to make from this slide, there are many interesting observations that Dr. Carmody has made. But if you look, in green are the most trusted sources, and in orange are the least trusted sources. And the 100 or so people who participated in this study were allowed to pick 3 most trusted and 3 least trusted. But look at this, the Orthodox Jewish physician networks, 60 who responded to this particular possibility said they were most trusted, and no one said they were least trusted. Similarly, my physician, my doctor, 80 said most trusted, and only 1 person said that was in their group of 3 least trusted. So the point I'm trying to make is that to convert vaccines into vaccinations, there are no organizations more important than JAMA, and there are no individuals more important than physicians. And this isn't unique to COVID. It's well established that the healthcare provider is the most important source for our patients in their decision-making about vaccine acceptance. So I'm really glad that you're joining us tonight and showing that you want to make a contribution as well. And I encourage everyone, the leaders of this organization and everyone joining the call, to be vaccine ambassadors and to take this as, in addition to all your many other responsibilities, as one of your responsibilities as well. And I'll just point out that the CDC and the health department don't do nearly as well amongst the Orthodox community in terms of their being a trusted source. A couple of quick things I just like to set straight from the beginning. a lot of people worry and wonder how these vaccines were developed so quickly. Were corners cut on safety? And I would just like to say that there were no corners cut on safety. It was accomplished in record time, really 10 months from the time that the phase 1 trial began in March. The viral sequence had become available in January. Phase 1 trials for Moderna and Pfizer RNA COVID vaccines began in late March and early May. And by December, the EUA was issued by FDA for both of those vaccines. So, really just 10 or 11 months from the time the virus was identified. And it was accomplished by NIH partnering with academia and industry and other government agencies to use existing clinical trial networks. The companies making vaccine even before they knew, making large amounts of vaccine even before they knew it was safe and effective. By using platforms like messenger RNA vaccines that had been studied for 10 or 20 years, but it just came at the right time when they were sort of ready for prime time. And it was just a matter of inserting the RNA sequence for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2, the COVID virus, into the RNA vector. There was intense oversight by regulatory authorities, and no corners were cut, but rather steps that normally happen in series were allowed to happen in parallel, given the medical emergency that we were living in. And I think maybe most of all, there was an amazing spirit of let's give it our all to try to fight this pandemic. And there was intense effort by all of those participating in the process. So then we had vaccines starting in December, and subsequently the J&J vaccine has also received its EUA. And the point I'm making here is that some people thought, well, now that we have a vaccine, the pandemic, is going to end pretty quickly. And that's not the case. It is not like a dichotomous on-off light switch. Rather, I think we have to think of this as akin to a dimmer switch, which once it's in the on position can slowly be twisted around and around to increase the light in the room. And that's the way it is with vaccine rollout. And we now have gotten to the point where it's pretty amazing. Let's say in Brooklyn, 42%, this is data from New York for just a week, a couple days ago, 42% of people have had one dose of vaccine in gray, and 27% of adults have had both doses of an RNA vaccine, or in other words, are fully vaccinated. And you can kind of look across the boroughs, across the age groups. Remember, younger individuals have just become eligible for EUA vaccines, so they're sort of lagging behind. The groups we started with, older adults, 65 and older, 2/3 have had at least one dose, and 56% are fully vaccinated. So it's pretty striking how far we've come just since really mid-December, a mere 4 months. It's really like, a wartime effort, a D-Day effort, whatever analogy you'd like to use. And yet we have ongoing research that needs to be done. We need several vaccines to provide enough vaccine for the world. Remember, our country is just about 7%, I believe it is, of the world population. We have 330 million Americans. There are over 7 billion people worldwide. And there may be several more vaccines beyond what we have that are needed to allow this to happen, allow global vaccination to happen. As long as there is COVID anywhere, we are at risk of COVID in the US because of the variants, because of global travel. So we really have to have a global perspective. And then there are a lot of questions that haven't yet been answered. The durability of the response. Do they actually prevent infection and transmission? What about the variants? What about all those groups that weren't included in the phase 3 trials, like those with transplant organs or those with immunosuppression? So lots of work to be done yet. And we're learning a lot with the now millions of people having been vaccinated. The clinical trials really only thousands of people had, tens of thousands of people was it possible to participate in the clinical trials. So we continue to learn. It's still a time, I believe, to be humble and to recognize that we don't know everything yet, but we sure know a lot more than we knew just a few months ago. So I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to this evening.
Thank you so much for that really incredible overview, Dr. Mulligan. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Ultman, who's an absolute pillar in the community, OBGYN, also an honoree, a JOMA honoree last year in our first annual symposium. Dr. Ultman received the Outstanding Achievement in the Community Award. She's a faculty attending in obstetrics and gynecology at Long Island Jewish Hospital, Northwell Health. She's an assistant professor at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra University. Dr. Ultman attended McGill Medical School and sits on numerous hospital committees, including the admissions committee of Hofstra Medical School. Dr. Ultman has received numerous awards for teaching medical students and residents, and most recently received the 2020 Teaching Award from the Association of Professors of Gynecology and Obstetrics. And we're really excited to learn from you tonight.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. So it's just, I am in the trenches. I'm not doing research in vaccines, but I do have to say, having been working through the height of the pandemic between March and May of last year, LIJ had the most COVID patients in New York State admitted to the hospital. We tested every patient that came in, we still do, in labor, and we came close to 20% positivity of patients. So we saw, unfortunately, very sick patients in the ICU. We had a few unfortunate deaths. So having a vaccine now is very heartening, and we are very on board with encouraging our patients to receive it. So I don't know, did my screen share? Okay, so this is the joint statement from the three main bodies in obstetrics and gynecology.
Dr. Ultman, can you just share your screen again?
Okay, one sec. It's not sharing. Let me see. Is it now? Is it sharing now? Is it sharing?
It's sharing.
Okay. So you have the statement?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a statement from ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. So these are the main big governing bodies in obstetrics and gynecology. And there was a lot of, since the initial research did not include pregnant patients, there was a lot of hesitancy to take the vaccine. So they came out with a very positive statement saying that as experts in reproductive health, we continue to recommend that the vaccine be available to pregnant individuals. We also assure patients that there's no evidence the vaccine can harm to loss of fertility. While fertility was not specifically studied in the clinical trials of the vaccine, no loss of fertility has been reported among trial participants or among the millions who have received the vaccine since their authorization. And no signs of infertility appeared in animal studies. Loss of fertility is scientifically unlikely. So that's a pretty strong statement from all three governing bodies. And it's a statement we've been emphasizing to our patient population. So why are we as obstetricians and gynecologists so want our patients to get the vaccine? Well, just being pregnant was found to be an independent factor of increasing your risk of having more serious disease from COVID-19. So this is just a few of the studies, a whole huge review, that 17% had pneumonia, 17% needed oxygen by cannula, 13.4% developed ARDS if they got COVID and were pregnant. 3.3 were admitted to the intensive care unit. 1.6 received invasive ventilation. There was a 2.4 increase needing ECMO and a 1.7-fold increase of death from COVID-19 for those that are pregnant. So just looking at these statistics, it seems we really want to prevent our patients to get COVID-19, and therefore we really want to encourage them to get vaccinated. So just for the CDC, they have it's called the VSafe Vaccine Health Tracker. So if you have patients that are pregnant, especially pregnant, because they really want all pregnant patients to be registered if they qualify, so that they could build up their study and their database, to have them register with the CDC. This is some statistics. Obviously, this is already old, since it was from February 16th, but they're ready from, we're ready in mid-April. I don't have those stats, but as of February 16th, they already had over 30,000 pregnancies registered. So the more data we have, the better to properly educate our patients. So just overall, this is not, to comment about this is a little hard since the vaccine rollout just happened in mid-December, and this is just 2 months later. So it's a little hard probably to talk about preterm births. But COVID itself, just on a side, COVID itself has been found to increase the risk of preterm birth. For every patient that is pregnant, the risk of a preterm birth is about 6%. The studies have shown that if a patient does get COVID, that risk of preterm birth increases to 16%. So it definitely has a significant effect on pregnant women. But what is interesting about this study is that for patients that did get the vaccine, so miscarriage happens really early. So I think this is actually the most significant part of this, is that it shows even a lower risk of miscarriage from the vaccine, but certainly it does not increase your risk of miscarriage. And this actually is pretty good data because patient gets the vaccine at 6 or 7 weeks of pregnancy. Most miscarriages happen less than 20 weeks. So I think this is pretty significant and very convincing to patients that want to get the vaccine early in the pregnancy. So what other advantages besides obviously preventing COVID-19? So preliminary research from Cornell shows that even after 5 days, the level of antibodies starts increasing in the woman. After 16 days of getting the vaccine, the first dose, there's already studies that show there's passive immunity to the neonate. So as a woman, if she gets the vaccine and 3 weeks later she gets the second vaccine, after 5 weeks, her levels of IgG are quite elevated. And that has gone, testing the neonate, it has been correlated that the neonate levels is linearly correlated to the maternal IgG levels. So the timing of the vaccine should be done to get the most benefit to the neonate. So the best time probably for patients to get the most benefit for the neonate would be it second or early third trimester, since the level of IgG will be at the highest after 6 weeks, and therefore the neonate will probably see more IgG levels. On a side that we've also learned with all our patients getting vaccinated, you have to coordinate with the Tdap. So what happens is we give the Tdap recommendation is in third trimester. Most places, they do not recommend that after getting a COVID vaccine, that you get another vaccine within the 2 weeks. So as an obstetrician or gynecologist or healthcare worker, you have to make sure most of us are telling our patients to first get the COVID vaccine because we feel that is more important at this stage. And then after they've received both doses of the COVID vaccine, they should wait 2 weeks and then get the Tdap, which we often give in third trimester. So another interesting study that recently came out, this came out of Israel. 84 women were studied. They provided 504 breast milk samples. So from those samples, the IgA was elevated 2 weeks after the first vaccine, and then 61.8% increased to 86.1% on week 4. So obviously a very significant increase as the weeks went by. The IgG antibodies were 91% positive at week 4 and 97% positive at week 5 and 6. So there is huge benefit for our women to get vaccinated during breastfeeding, even though the studies have not been fully out about the benefits or have been tested on women that are breastfeeding. But this preliminary study shows that really there's a huge benefit to the infant if a mother is vaccinated. Okay, the only thing that came out of the study in terms of adverse events for infants had a fever, of which they all were upper respiratory infections, and they all resolved without treatment. So definitely encourage your breastfeeding patients to get vaccinated because there is definitely appears to be a huge benefit to the infant. And it's just a very short summary, and this is one of the ACOG websites that you could go on to further look into what the recommendations are for pregnant and lactating patients. But as a whole, my group and almost all the OBGYNs that I work with, we are all encouraging our patients to get vaccinated and get vaccinated preconceptually is best. If they are pregnant, to get the vaccine as early as first or second trimester to prevent the risk of preterm birth, and to get the advantage of having the neonate get the vaccine, get the antibodies. And then for our breastfeeding women, definitely they should get vaccinated if they didn't get it during the pregnancy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ultman, for that really great overview. And I know that, you know, the pregnancy concerns are definitely something that we're all dealing with. So thank you. Before I introduce our third panelist, I just want to remind everyone that we do have CME for this event. So please look out at the end. I'll be sharing the slide how to log into the system and claim CME. And we'll also be posting a survey for attendees that we'd really appreciate if you'd fill out, because that helps us do an even better job next time. So Dr. Dorit Rubinstein Rice is a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. Increasingly, her research and activities are focused on legal issues related to vaccines, including exemption laws and tort liability related to non-vaccination. She publishes law review and peer-reviewed articles on and many blog posts on legal issues related to vaccines. She received an undergraduate degree in law and political science from the Faculty of Law in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and received her PhD from the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program in UC Berkeley. She's a member of the Parent Advisory Board of Voices for Vaccines and the Vaccine Working Group on Ethics and Policy, and active in vaccine advocacy in many ways. And you may have also heard her being interviewed by Dr. Minkin on the JOMA podcast. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm here a little bit wearing two hats. One is I write about law and vaccines, and the other is I go on social media and try to correct anti-vaccine misinformation. And I hope what I say draws on both things. I do want to make three preliminary comments. First, I want to thank everyone for all the work you've been doing during this pandemic. As a layperson, I am incredibly grateful to all the medical people who've been in the front line, either of treatment or research, for everything you've done for us through this. Second, I have two little kids in the other room, and I hope they don't come, but I apologize in advance if we have a cameo. And third, I have a conflict of interest statement, which is we own stock in GSK. I'm not sure it's connected to today because GSK doesn't have an advanced vaccine candidate for COVID-19, but just for full disclosure. So I want to make a few points drawing on what I've learned and looked at. And some of this you already know, but it might help to put it in context. First, to remind you, you're going to come across people whose attitude to vaccine vary from a continuum of supporting vaccines to opposing vaccines, with somewhere at the edges, public health officials who will strongly advocate for vaccines. And on the other edge, the anti-vaccine movement, who's going to try to scare the people you come across. And a lot of your work is probably going to be somewhere in the center. You don't have to do much for people who are already strong supporters, and you probably can't reach most of the extreme opponents, but there's a lot of people that you can move one way or the other. Second, when you come across the people who are at the extreme end of vaccine opposition, it might help to think about the anti-vaccine movement as having several layers, as including at the very least, the people who create the misinformation, the organizers, medium influencers that spread it to thousands of people, and the people we're most likely to encounter in day-to-day interaction, which are the grassroots activists. And the reason I'm mentioning it is to remind you that the grassroots activists, the people kind of at the bottom of the pyramid scheme of the anti-vaccine movement, are people who are passionate, sincere, really believe what they're saying, and it comes across, and think they're doing good by pushing back against vaccine misinformation. These are not people who are out to harm, and interacting with them should keep in mind that they want to do the best, they just are coming in with the wrong set of facts. I find this helps me interact online and remain calm and hopefully relatively respectful. I hope it might help you. I want to make some points about regulation, and in part I'm making them to alert you that I can answer questions on this. First, I want to repeat the point already made by Dr. Mulligan, which is we have extensive regulation of the vaccine area. Even if you don't trust government, for anyone to hide something about vaccines, you'd have to have the cooperation not just of two federal agencies, CDC and FDA, but the cooperation of external expert committees in the CDC, in the FDA, and outside them, in hiding whatever it is you want to hide. It's unlikely you'll get everybody there on board. That includes tenured professors that don't have a stake in hiding what the government wants to hide and so forth. We also have 4 different computerized monitoring systems looking intensely in these vaccines, and Dr. Ultman already mentioned vSafe in addition to these, that is tracking COVID-19 vaccine. I don't think we've had any vaccine that was looked at so closely. There's extremely active monitoring, and when people are concerned, we need to point out that we're looking at this. This is not ignored. There's no way to hide anything. There's too many actors involved. Not no way, but it's hard. We know that government isn't as good at hiding things as it might think. The other areas I want you to keep in mind legally is, first of all, you may be hearing a lot of concern about mandates. We can expect a certain level of mandates. I don't think we'll see a lot of state level mandates, although in New York, you're seeing the passport that's created by the state, but probably going to be implemented by private actors. But we are and will continue to see mandates by employers, mandates by private business who want to limit who can come in. There's 2 points to keep in mind on that. First of all, the legality is going to depend, and whether someone has an available exception from the mandate is going to depend as well. You're probably not going to need to answer a detailed legal question, but you need to be aware that people are coming in with concerns about mandate, and they may well see these mandates. And there may be a question of, how do I interact with someone who's getting the vaccine just because of the mandate? Am I doing my job? Are they getting informed consent if that's how they're coming in? The answer is, if you give them the right information, and if they make the decision still looking at the balance of risk. The mandate may be in the background, but they're still making, hopefully, an informed decision. But this is one of the things that will come into your practice. The other thing that might come in, and that's might come in as a talking point, is the question of liability, legal liability. People will come in and say vaccine manufacturers don't have liability. And for COVID, they're right. So for routine vaccines, we have a compensation program and there are liability protection, but they're limited. COVID-19 vaccines aren't in that situation. The liability protection for COVID-19 vaccines are very strong. It's going to be hard to take a COVID vaccine manufacturer or provider or administrator, if that's you, to court if something happens. And the government compensation program we have is hard to use. However, while it's true that there are real liability protection on vaccines, that doesn't mean the vaccines are unsafe. The question of liability is separate from the question of safety, and we have other tools to assure safety. And that's the point I hope you'll take with you. Yes, liability protections are real. They're in place for COVID-19 vaccine and for COVID-19 treatments as well, but they don't mean vaccines are unsafe. The last thing I want to mention, and I know I'm covering a bit of unconnected topics, but I also want to signal these are things that I can go deeper in if you have questions, is if you're not just interacting with patients, but are already also going online and sharing good vaccine information or speaking in forums, etc. And I really hope you do, because we need people who know what they're talking about to go out and speak about this. As you probably know, many in your community have done amazing work during the measles outbreak in educating people about vaccines and in other contexts. Your role is crucial. I want to remind you that if that happens, you may find yourself being targeted for harassment. That's kind of the dark underside of speaking up about vaccines that nobody talks about. But I want to put it out because I want to remind you that there are resources if that's you and that we still need you anyway. I want to remind you that you may find yourself, especially online, subject to name calling and insults. You may face attempts to get you fired. You may face bad fake reviews. All of these things have happened to doctors that have spoken out about vaccines. I have some examples, but I'm not sure you want to see them. It can happen. Again, the two things I want to keep you to keep in mind about them is, first, we still really need you. We need you helping patients, as was mentioned earlier. You're saving lives by doing this. You're doing a mitzvah, you're doing God's work. And we need you online as well. Second, I want to remind you that we do have resources. And if any of you find yourself in that situation, please reach out. We have some handouts and some instructions on how to protect yourself from harassment. And we have a couple of support groups. So I do want to put that as well on the table. And I'll stop now, and I hope you have a lot of questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rice, for that incredible overview. And I know I speak for all the other healthcare workers that we really appreciate your support and saying what you've said about resources and understanding the difficulty of sometimes, speaking out like you said. I want to remind everyone, if anyone joined us a little bit late, that this event is being recorded. It will be available after we finish tonight. And we'll also be sharing the CME information at the end of the event, so you can claim CME. And I'll also be posting a survey that we'd really appreciate if you'll fill out, so that we can get your feedback and do an even better job next time. So I'm going to start by asking some questions that were submitted by our audience tonight. These are anonymous questions, and maybe I'll just have everyone, whoever wants to answer the question, raise your hand. Maybe that will be the easiest way to go. Okay, so here's the first question. How can they recommend the public to take the vaccine if it is only in trial stages and nobody's 100% sure of the benefits or risk or side effects of the vaccine? By now, we all know of medications and plasma treatments that are really effective in treating the COVID virus. Why don't we just treat the people who have COVID? Nobody can assure you that the vaccine will prevent you from contracting the virus, or that if you're vaccinated, you won't infect others if you do get the virus. So what's the point in vaccinating? That's the question. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I'd be happy to start the ball on that one. Thank you for the question. I think we have very strong evidence that the vaccines are highly effective. All of the EUA vaccines were shown to have 75 to 95% protection in trials that enrolled thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And they were shown to be very, very safe in those trials as well. And as Dr. Wright said, these studies had independent safety boards that were monitoring them, multiple committees reviewing things, a very public, open, transparent process. The FDA hearings, when the vaccines were being considered for their EUA emergency use authorization, were public. They were available online. All of the meeting materials are available online and still are. You can watch those. You can look at the materials. It is true that these are not licensed. The vaccines have been authorized, given that we're in an emergency, public health emergency, and we expect that they will be fully licensed. For example, Pfizer now has 6 months of safety and efficacy data. Good news there. The vaccine continues to look very, very safe, and at 6 months, as far out as 6 months, which is the farthest data we have, still over 90% protection. And with that 6-month data, they will soon be going to FDA for full licensure. So I think both Pfizer and Moderna, it won't be too long, probably this late spring, early summer, and they'll get full licensure. And I guess I'd say that I would disagree with the questioner in that we have highly effective treatment. I think our treatment is kind of modest at best. I wish we had better treatments. We've participated in a number of treatment trials, and we're glad to have some of the antivirals, the remdesivir, some of the anti-inflammatories like steroids, baricitinib, which have been shown to have some benefit. But we still don't have great treatment. Of people that are hospitalized, 5 to 10% end up dying. It's a really shocking figure. 500,000 people have died, over 500,000 in the US, as we heard at the beginning from Dr. Kadish. In a normal flu year, we have 12 to 56,000 deaths. So in the first year, in 1 year of this coronavirus pandemic, we've had 570,000 million deaths, 10 times higher. So I don't think we should have the idea that infection is something that's sort of okay, and then you get immunity after, and it's not that big a deal, and we have great treatment. That's really not the case. Frankly, and this is a bit self-serving since I'm a vaccinologist, but our vaccines are a lot better than our treatments right now. We need better treatments. So I would encourage everyone to get vaccinated, to be safe for yourself, for your family members. Even if you think you might not need the vaccine, if you get vaccinated, you'd be less likely to transmit the virus to those around you who might be very vulnerable and susceptible to death, like those who are older, who have chronic conditions. I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. Here's our next question. Is there a risk of reduced chances of fertility after taking the vaccine? Does the vaccine affect the ability for a woman to conceive and carry a baby to full term? Dr. Ultman?
Yeah, so as I presented, so far there has been no study has shown that. There's been nothing to prove that it has affected fertility, and no study that has shown that it has affected pregnancy. But there are studies that show getting COVID when you are pregnant significantly affects the outcome of your pregnancy. Just the fact that your preterm your preterm delivery rate goes from 6% to 16% was a big study that came out, or that the risk of stillborn is slightly increased, and the risk of death is increased for pregnant patients over the general population that do get COVID, is enough of a reason to consider getting the vaccine. So there has been no study. We're kind of trying to understand where all this publicity came from, that it affects fertility. It seems to be based a lot in social media. There has been no study to show this. And we're all very confused why there has been such negative backlash about the vaccine for young women.
Thanks so much. Here's our next question. Does the vaccine cause an increased risk of autoimmune diseases?
Well, I can start on that one as well. In the clinical trials that were done that enrolled between, for example, for the messenger RNA vaccines, over almost 80,000 trial participants, half of whom received the vaccine, so over 40,000 people receiving the vaccines. There was no evidence of an autoimmune condition. The RNA vaccines are extremely safe, and subsequently, millions and millions of people have received these vaccines, probably in excess of 50 million people or more now. And again, the RNA vaccines, we haven't seen any evidence of autoimmune conditions. It is a fair question because the vaccine, the RNA, can trigger an innate immune response. We call it self-adjuvanting. There are molecules in our fast responding cells, the innate immune system, that recognize RNA and trigger an inflammatory response. But that's actually part of what makes these vaccines work so well. And there's no evidence that you have a prolonged self-targeted autoimmune response with those vaccines.
This is a question for Dr. Rice. How do you respond to patients who believe that their medical professional is getting a kickback for recommending the vaccine?
The problem is, how do you respond to something? And I think both Dr. Ultman and Dr. Mangan just raised that. How do you respond to something that really isn't true? You can start by just saying, I do not get any bonus whether you vaccinate or not. In this case, in the case of COVID-19 vaccine, you also don't get a payment because the vaccine are covered by the government, although there may be an administrative fee, and even that's limited. So the best you can probably do is really say, here's a little bit about how I get compensated. It doesn't depend on whether you take the COVID-19 vaccine or not. There's at least some chance that if you get COVID, I'll be seeing you more and I'll be getting paid more over that, but I'd rather not have that payment. Thank you.
That's great. I love that. If someone had COVID a year ago and got the first and second vaccines, how long do they have to isolate after the second dose? Also 2 weeks like everyone else, even though they had COVID a long time ago. I'm assuming the questioner meant if the person was exposed to someone that has COVID, do they still need to isolate if they've not had the full 2 weeks after their second dose? So they're not officially excluded from having to quarantine after being exposed. Meaning, does the fact that the person had COVID count for something in this case? We've had quite a few questions along these same lines.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start on that one. So we know that there is some natural protection after a viral infection. The body has immune memory and it persists for months, usually, and longer. That's how our immune system is designed, so that if we encounter the same pathogen in the future, we can fight it off. That's why it's rather unusual to, for example, get chicken's pox once you've had it once, immune memory. And that's really how vaccines work. They establish immunologic memory, T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes that remember. However, with some viruses, there's waning of immunity more quickly than with others. And it seems clear that maybe in the first 3 months or so, there's pretty good protection against reinfection, but that over time, for those who've had past COVID, there's risk of a second infection. And that's why, that's in part why it's recommended that even if you've had COVID before, you receive the COVID vaccine. And one thing we're learning is that the antibody responses, for example, after vaccination are actually much stronger and higher in magnitude than after natural infection. So in this case, if I understood the question, an individual had prior COVID, they got their first vaccine, then they were either exposed or infected, and how long do they need to either isolate or quarantine? And in that case, they're not fully vaccinated, so if it's an exposure situation, they would need to quarantine according to the usual guideline. And then if it was that they had gotten infected after their first vaccine, they would need to isolate after the usual guideline because they're not yet fully vaccinated. I would say that one important point is that this is one of the amazing things about these vaccines. They're so effective. Even one dose of the RNA vaccines, in that interval until the second dose, 3 weeks for Pfizer, 4 weeks for Moderna, in that interval between first and second dose, there is about 50% protection for the Pfizer vaccine in reducing COVID-19, and there's about 80% protection with the Moderna vaccine in that 3 to 4 week window between vaccines. So even a single dose of these vaccines are protective, but they're not fully protective, and even 2 doses are not fully protective, 95% protection with 2 doses. So there will be some people who get vaccinated and become infected. They're not perfect, but boy, they're awfully good.
I'm going to piggyback one more question on this, Dr. Mulligan. Another question that came in that asks, has there been studies on how long a person has positive antibodies or has immunity after a vaccine? I work in a New York State nursing home, and they have lifted quarantine regulations after an exposure to COVID, but only for 3 months after the second dose.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And those are the kinds of guidelines now we're seeing starting to emerge. If you're fully vaccinated, these are some of the things that can be different in your life. For example, if you're a grandparent like me, you can go and visit your grandkids, which I did last weekend for the first time in a year. It was wonderful. If you're a healthcare worker and you get exposed and you're fully vaccinated, you don't have to quarantine. That's right. And they're saying 3 months. That was based on the antibody data that was available at the time they made that recommendation. And that was that there was good durability of the antibody responses as far out as 3 months, which was as far as had been looked at. Just in the last 2 weeks, important information from both Pfizer and Moderna. From Pfizer, that protection, and I said this earlier, protection is still over 90% as far out as 6 months. So I suspect that guideline will be revised to extend out to 6 months. The good news in this way from Moderna, this was published in New England Journal about 10, 12 days ago, that their antibody responses are still staying quite high 6 months out as well. So really good news. I would project that these vaccines will continue to provide protection for several more months beyond this 6 month that we know of currently, but we'll have to stay tuned until enough time has passed for us to have that data.
So I love how you explained that, these guidelines probably will change. I want to ask Dr. Rice to comment on that, because that's something that comes up a lot. Why are the guidelines constantly changing? Doesn't this mean no one actually knows anything and they're just making it up and they're just making us crazy? How do you respond to something like that?
2 things. First of all, even in normal times, what science does is respond to data. As we have more data, and we never have complete data on anything. We're not all knowing. As we have more data, we may change what the recommendation is. In a pandemic, we have to make recommendations early without good data because people need the answers. You can't wait. But when you make recommendation based on limited data, you may have to change them as time adjusts. That's not a problem with what people are doing. That's a sign that they're paying attention to the data. They're responding to what we learn as we go forth. The other part is that, and this is not going to increase us, but it's the reality. Policymakers can make mistakes. And sometimes what happened was they made a decision on early data and it was wrong. And people with honesty change their mind. If someone never admits a mistake, if you've listened to them for 10 years and they never admitted a mistake, maybe you should worry. The right thing to do is if you found out that you made a mistake is adjust and move on. We can, my dad used to say, the only people who make no mistakes are people who do nothing, and that's a mistake by itself. So we have limited data. We want them to update it, and sometimes they'll make mistakes, but we all do the best we can.
Thanks so much. Dr. Ultman, here's a question for you. When is the best time within your cycle to get the vaccine to minimize any effects on your cycle?
So I honestly don't know. There has been recent data that it might affect your cycle slightly. I mean, it's self-limiting. It's not an issue if you have some irregular bleeding because of the vaccine. But this is all very recent data that just came out. So, I mean, it's not concerning to us if somebody has an irregular cycle once. It's not medically that worrisome. Usually we would just recommend see what happens the following cycle. And if it's still irregular, then you should probably be seeing the gynecologist. So yeah, for us, it's not, if you have some irregular bleeding associated with the vaccine, I would just say, wait another cycle, see what happens. And if it's still irregular, I wouldn't associate it with the vaccine and you should come and see the gynecologist. But I also wanted to comment just about in terms of antibodies and having past infections. So I know within the Orthodox community, especially in March and April early on, so many within the Orthodox community did get COVID. And there was a feeling that, okay, I had COVID and I'm immune to this. And so there is a lack of incentive, I find, in some of my patients to actually get the vaccine because they do think they are still immune to it. And interesting, we test antibodies when pregnant patients come in for their first prenatal visit. And then I often in third trimester or second trimester, when we do the glucose test, I often retest to see if their antibodies were positive in first trimester. I at least like to retest them to see if they didn't get vaccinated, if their antibodies are still positive. And many are not after quite a few months. So I think it's very important to educate the community, the fact that just because they had COVID back in March, when so many people got it during the Purim holidays or Pesach early on, doesn't mean at this point, a year later, that they're not going to get it again. I think it's very, very important that the community is aware of this. That's just my 2 cents.
Yes, well, very, very valuable 2 cents. Thanks for that. And I've absolutely heard that from many, friends, colleagues. It's definitely something a lot of people say. I'm sure we've all heard that. Another question: how do they determine the correct dose for children, and is it safe when their systems are so different than adults? Dr. Mulligan?
Yes, so this is really important, and we have only one vaccine that currently has an approval for children who are 16 or 17. That's the Pfizer. The other vaccines are for adults 18 and over. However, the vaccines are being studied in children, very important. We recently heard about data from one of the companies for 12 to 15-year-olds, and they're getting ready to file for emergency approval for that. So I think we'll see over time that these vaccines will become available as we go through this 2021 year for first probably 12 to 15-year-olds, and then maybe 5 to 11-year-olds, and then moving on down. And the way we do this in vaccinology is fairly standard, and that is that the vaccines are studied first in adults. And when they're shown to be safe and effective in adults, they can go to studies in children. And often based on the mere fact of body weight, the dosage is reduced in children. So we don't, for example, with many of the vaccines that are given to both adults and children, we don't necessarily give the same dose to children. So there often is an adjustment made in dosage. And in the clinical trials, there may be a couple of different doses that are tried, usually starting with a lower dose to be sure everything is safe in children, just as it was in adults. And then if the immune response from that is not quite as good, the antibody levels quite as good as we would have liked, a slightly higher dose can be tried. So it's done in that way. And we won't be repeating these 30,000 person studies in each of these children age groups. Rather, we do what are called bridging studies in usually hundreds or maybe 1,000 children. And we call it a bridging study because we take the idea that, okay, if it looks safe here, great. And if the antibody levels are analogous to what we have in adults, in other words, let's say a titer of neutralizing antibody of 200, then we assume that that will provide the same level of protection. So we let the immunogenicity serve to bridge for efficacy as a surrogate for efficacy, because it really wouldn't be practical and not very efficient to do multiple 30,000 person studies in different age groups of children.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rice, general question. How do you approach vaccine hesitant patient, and specifically, how do you respond to someone who says, all these companies have been sued many times for medication adverse effects, why should we trust them?
So I do want to make one point on Dr. Mulligan's comment, which is, if you want to enroll your children in trial, there's some that you can enroll in now, and that generally for vaccines that have been licensed, we don't have to relicense them for indications as well. If you're expanding the population, you just have to change the indication. How to approach a vaccine hesitant patient is a very individualistic question. You want to listen to the patient as a first step and understand why. So there's several approaches to do that, and they all boil down to listen, relate, give them what they need, be willing to build trust over time. Sometimes it's not a one-time discussion. And I'll get to the point of sued many times in a moment. So listen what the concerns of this specific patients are. Not all patients need the same level of response or the same broad approach, etc. Relate, do something to remind them that you're human, that you care, that you're listening. Some doctors tell about why they decided to vaccinate themselves or their children. Some doctors may explain why they got into medicine to help someone else's children and so forth. But remind the other person that you're another human that's relating. Give them what they need. Some people are looking for reassurance. Some people are looking for answers. And it won't always be the same. The answer to the specific question of these companies have been sued many times is twofold. A, we don't want to trust pharmaceutical companies, just as we don't want to have to trust completely any other big organization. Generally speaking, we want to be able to fact check. In vaccines, we have multiple sources of information and multiple eyes on the pharmaceutical companies. We don't need to wait for data from them. We have a lot of other sources that so I used to study accountability, and in accountability, we say one of the things you really want is redundant accountability system. Different eyes that will catch if one of them missed something. We have a lot of eyes on vaccine safety, and hopefully those multiple eyes will help you catch a problem. The other part is, while it's true that pretty much every pharmaceutical company has this kind of, not all of them, for example, Moderna has some areas where they run into trouble. almost all of these are not in vaccines. So it's kind of like saying, don't buy the Fiesta, because there was a scandal 20 years ago about the Ford Pinto. You can choose not to buy the Fiesta, but you're kind of cutting off your own nose if the Fiesta is the right car for you and something you need. Don't let the fact that there were other scandals in other areas stop you from doing something that's good for you, like getting vaccinated and protecting yourself.
Wow, that's very powerful. So it's we're sort of running out of time. I really want to thank everyone who has participated tonight, not only our speakers, but also we're really getting just an incredible number of questions. If we do not get to your question tonight, you're in the majority. Unfortunately, we really just are not be able to get through all of them, but I just want to thank you for submitting the questions. I'll end with one question for Dr. Ultman before sharing some other information. Please stay till the end so you can get that. And then also, please remember that we're happy to continue answering your questions. You can send them to our email address. And if we don't answer right away, send us another email. We really appreciate all the questions and really want to be able to answer every single one of them. So the last question from the audience is for Dr. Ultman. Have the breast milk studies shown antibody response in the infants or just the presence of antibodies in the milk?
It's just antibodies within the milk, but that gives protection for the neonate. So it's antibodies in the milk.
Okay, great.
I have to go.
Yes, okay.
I have a patient in labor.
I know you're on call. You're like actually working currently in the.
So if there's any emails, you could always email the questions and I can answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ultman. So just the last few minutes, I had mentioned earlier on that, we're looking to make it easier for you to share good information with your patients. This is a trifold that we've just developed about COVID vaccines. So I know that it's certainly difficult for anyone to answer everyone's questions in general about their health, let alone also have a conversation about the vaccine. For many of us, here is what the trifold looks like. It answers basic questions and basic myths about the vaccine, and it also has information of how to access more of our educational materials. We are providing this for free for anyone that is interested in having this in their office. Please email us at please email us at vaxfax@joma.org, and I'll share that also in just one second. Here you go. Okay, so this is the email address. If you're interested in getting these trifolds in your office, again, we're doing this for free at no charge. And we also have a similar poster that will be printed and will be available. So anyone who's interested in hanging this up or giving it out, at your place of work, please reach out to us. Here is the CME information. Again, thanks to Touro University for sponsoring CME for this event. If you have any questions about this, you can also feel free to email us. It will expire tomorrow. And the last thing is, sorry about that, I'm going to reshare this. This is a survey. It's a QR code. You can also, if you're not familiar with QR codes, you can access it at
Dr. Knoll, can you resend on your screen the information? None of the slides showed up.
Oh.
You're currently sharing a screen with the GIF of the.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. So here again, what I was talking about before, to request educational materials, please email us. We're happy to send it to you for free to your office or to anywhere that you think people might be interested in looking at this. Here is the CME information. If you have any questions about this, you can also email us. And thanks again to Touro for providing CME for this event. And here is the QR code. We really, really appreciate it if you fill this out. It means a lot to us to hear your feedback. and we take your feedback quite seriously. You'll be entered into a giveaway for a $100 Amazon gift card. That's always a fun thing to use. You can also access this survey at www.joma.org. And again, if there's any questions that you haven't had answered, any feedback, please reach out to us. And thanks again so much to our panelists, Dr. Ultman, Dr. Rice, Dr. Mulligan. We really cannot thank you enough. We just are just so overwhelmed by the information that you've shared and the support that you've given us. And just thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.